Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Monday, March 16th, and today we're going to talk about a couple of transits that are coming up this week. We have the planet Mars going through a conjunction with Jupiter, and then coming up into a conjunction with Pluto, and then eventually we're going to have Jupiter hit the conjunction with Pluto. So it's a big series of transits, mostly from Mars this week, so that's what we're going to talk about first. Then we're going to talk about Pan. We're going to talk about words that are related to Pan, like pandemonium and panic, and what this goat god has to do with the sign of Capricorn and how that might help us to conceptualize some of the mythic dimensions of the transit that we're all living through right now in the midst of this pandemic. So we're going to talk about Pan in part 2 today. Part 1 will be looking at the transits. Part 2 a little bit more, on the mythos of Pan, and you can find the timestamps below. All right, so let's begin by just giving you a visual of what's coming up. We'll start by taking a look at these conjunctions from Mars to Jupiter and Pluto. So you can see here, Mars is in the sign of Capricorn right now, like everything. And Mars is going to be going through a couple of conjunctions to Jupiter and Pluto. You can see all of those right there. And these conjunctions, let's time them out really quick here. The conjunctions are already in range because Mars is within that 3-degree engagement space. And so we pay close attention to that. Mars will conjoin with Jupiter first, starting late this week, Thursday, Friday. It'll go through the conjunction to Jupiter. And then it'll conjoin with Pluto by early next week, Monday into Sunday into Monday. So we have about a week in front of us right now where we are going to be experiencing the very powerful effects of Mars's conjunction to Jupiter and then conjunction to Pluto. Right after that, we're going to be talking about Jupiter conjoined with Pluto again, which I've already done a talk on. You can go back and listen to if you want. But we haven't spent a lot of time talking about how Mars is going to impact Jupiter and Pluto with its conjunctions. So that's what we're going to do today. So there's a lot that can be said about this conjunction. Let's remember, first of all, which planets we're dealing with. We're dealing with Mars, god of war. We're dealing with Jupiter, which is a planet that is associated with the moral and cosmic order, also with largeness, grandness, bigness, expansion. And we're also dealing with Pluto, Hades, the lord of the underworld, and the god associated with both death and rebirth. So what do you get when you put all three of these together? We're really going to talk about all three of them together since it's just such a bang series of transits and aspects that are being made. So let's put them all three of them together. First of all, you can get these very intense amplifications. The Jupiter is going to amplify Mars and create a lot of bravado and a lot of just over the top, really big, enthusiastic Mars energy. Mars being courage, bravery, competition, conflict. Put them together and you have militarism, you have bravery, you have victory, you have the talent and the pageantry of sports and war and athletes in their uniforms and the national anthem and the trophies. And so the whole kind of and as well as you can think of soldiers marching in unison with drums and uniforms and guns and all of this kind of stuff. You have the pageantry of war. You have the sense of the bravado of Mars because you're amplifying Mars, making it a lot bigger. Jupiter also is the great benefic, so you think about victory and trophies and things like that. So first of all, you can just see this kind of over-the-top Mars energy. But when we're coupling that with Pluto, we're coupling it with intensity, depth, power, darkness. And so when those things come together, then sometimes you're going to get, the moral, courageous act done in the face of darkness. You're going to get these powerful, almost like waves of bravado, courage, action, determination in the face of darkness or in the face of, some kind of very intense life or death circumstance. Mars, Jupiter, Pluto is also incredibly volcanic and cathartic. You think about the three of them coming together and you think about things like explosions. But the explosion can be a moral explosion, an energetic explosion, a spiritual explosion, usually toned by the Plutonian need to survive or to face or deal with the subject of darkness. And again, the word intensity comes to mind, where there's a feeling of drive with Mars Pluto, intensity, catharsis, convulsion, expulsion, purgation, like volcanoes erupting, that kind of thing. But also with Jupiter, then you're adding the possibility of something moral and good and just, right? So sometimes you'll see acts of great heroism and courage coming through, or you'll see the need to, like right now, one of the things that we're seeing that would match very well with this would be the widespread mobilization of resources, energies, and efforts trying to combat or face some kind of impending doom. I know that sounds kind of heavy, but that's what it is. So you can also see the potential for there to be something that is an action that is based on the idea to do good, to protect against darkness on a wide scale. These are, after all, Pluto often represents things that are happening in the collective, that are happening on a wider scale. On the other hand, you can see things like the desire to conquer or dominate. So Mars, Jupiter being sort of militaristic and Pluto being sort of dark. So ruthlessness, domination, conquering attitudes. You can see a lot of kind of displays of self-righteousness, anger, chest beating, drum pounding, I'm the one who's right, I've got the answer. And sometimes that there's going to be the element of fear involved, pounding the drum of fear and, trying to stir up, or if you imagine the drum that's beaten before, trying to rouse the spirits of a group of warriors as they rush down a hill into battle and trying to amp them up. That's a bit like Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto. You have the potential to do something too intense, too big, and too extreme. So, something, you can easily sort of overdo things right now. So it's an interesting time because like we said in a video that I did earlier on on Jupiter Pluto, excuse me, he said, there's a fine line between the fear of the widespread pandemic and the actual pandemic. They're not identical to one another, but they're closely related. How can we take note of an invader, so to speak, while also remaining open-hearted, open-minded, without, it's very similar if you think about Star Wars, right? And the conundrum that Luke Skywalker finds himself in when trying to confront and face darkness. In The Empire Strikes Back, sorry to get really nerdy, he goes into the cave of darkness where Yoda tells him, the dark side of the Force is very strong in that place. And he goes in bringing a weapon, and Yoda's like, nah, probably shouldn't bring that with you. You won't need it. As if to say the resources that you need to face this darkness come from within, not from without, not in a weapon. And so don't weaponize your fear. Don't hand it a weapon. And then, he goes into the cave. He faces Darth Vader, pulls his sword or his lightsaber, cuts off Darth Vader's head. The mask falls open, and there's his own face. And it's this deep lesson about what we oppose and how we oppose, how we oppose or deal with or confront darkness in the Return of the Jedi. And by the way, if these are spoilers, then like I don't know where you've been the last like 40 years or whatever. So anyway, so in Return of the Jedi, of course, when he has to face the dark side of the Force, he tries to face it by fighting, and it doesn't work. It's only when he surrenders, gives up, and opens himself up that the hand of fate, the hand of providence, however you want to talk about it, takes hold and darkness is overcome. There's very similar teachings all throughout the Tao Te Ching, the I Ching, and many different wisdom schools traditionally, yoga, even martial arts, that our responsiveness to something that is intrusive or that something that's an attacker or an aggressor is very, very important, because oftentimes it's how we flow with the onslaught of some kind of an attack that matters. Mars, Jupiter, Pluto sometimes you could think of Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto as someone who's really great kind of warrior, good in crisis situation, a surgeon who's dealing with life or death situations in an ER or something like that. But you could also think of someone who almost acts preemptively or ruthlessly, or meets kind of tries to cancel out a wrong with another wrong, almost like gets too intense in the way that one would try to respond to an aggressor or a threat. So we have to be a little bit careful of that, even if it's just psychologically. I'm not speaking at all about, measures that people are taking to social distance. I mean, my family's social distancing right now, so is our nanny, our kids, my daughter's preschool is shut down. So, these things are appropriate, but it's the attitude, it's the psyche and what's going on in the soul and the mind that can make or break us on so many levels during an experience like this, and how we relate to one another and how we get on and how we recover and how we move through it. So we have to be very careful, because this energy of Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto can get kind of like might makes right. It can get into the mindset of dominating that which opposes or conflicts with us. And that's why we also see the potential for self-righteous anger. But we also have where there is will and action and the need for, to try to create some kind of moral, virtuous response to something threatening or dark. That's there right now too. And it's such a fine line. Now, with all of these energies being ultimately disposed of by Saturn, and Saturn is, of course, a planet that likes restriction and limitation and discipline. It is possible that what we are seeing with Mars conjoining Jupiter and Pluto over the next week will result in a lot more sanctions. There'll be an almost militant drive to set limits and boundaries, and we'll see that amplified over the course of the next week, because who are all of these planets hosted by right now? They're all hanging out in Saturn's house, which means that Saturn may come in and say, okay, there's going to be limits. We can also see this depicted by the fact that over the course of the next week, Saturn's going to move signs into Aquarius, which is a humane sign. It's an air sign, and that is a sign that has to do with people and groups. And classically, we'd also think of Aquarius in relation to our humankind, right? Again, it was called a humane sign. When Saturn moves into that sign, one of the things that can happen is we can see restricted social movement. It wouldn't be the case all of the time, but it would be in the context of what we're dealing with right now, with a bunch of planets, Pluto, Jupiter, Mars getting together in Capricorn, and then Saturn moving into the humane sign of Aquarius. As this is taking place, social restrictions may start to play a bigger role. The other thing that can happen is that this moment can produce a kind of breakthrough in terms of science and humane, higher rational solutions to problems. So Saturn moving into Aquarius isn't the worst thing when it comes to perhaps the initial testing of a vaccine or the development of some kinds of cures or preventative measures or something like that. The ability to mobilize resources intelligently. Saturn moving into an air sign is nice, because it just gets a little bit more rational, and it starts to tune into the higher mind a little bit more, which could be good in terms of just this being a moment of sort of mobilization of resources and efforts in the face of something dark. And all of a sudden you've got a very lofty, airy Saturn that you're dealing with, which is like kind of like an engineer or a scientist or a chemist. So that's a really nice potential silver lining, I think, right now. But you can also see, the potential for the, almost like launching or campaigning for something, like sort of like military. But what I want to say is like large tasks or large projects, because there's a kind of, that Saturnine energy. Mars very action oriented. It's exalted in Capricorn, really likes to get stuff done. Jupiter is wide scale. Pluto is transformational, facing something dark. So you do think of those things happening right now in the world. Obviously, I'm speaking mostly implied. I'm speaking about the coronavirus, but I'm also like, any of these things could show up in relation to work or your personal life or things that you're going through in your relationships. So you could see this in a number of different places. I don't mean to like over talk about the coronavirus, but obviously it's kind of the topic right now. So I feel like the number of emails that I'm getting, again, just people kind of, worried. And I wanted to make sure I address this, because it's quite clear that the way this is playing out in the collective is definitely in relation to the coronavirus. That's the main thing we're seeing all over. But we have moral stature and bravery and courage. Again, you can have catharsis, and you can think of this as a kind of moment of a peak moment of intense catalyzed transformation, with some sense of systems that are falling apart or whose integrity are being challenged. That's Jupiter in its fall, and the need to try to restore moral order. But you can also think of Mars as the aggressor, the thing coming in to challenge and threaten, and the kind of kill drive of Jupiter, of Mars and Pluto, that are sort of sandwiching Jupiter in and saying, I threaten the economy, I threaten the markets, I threaten social stability, I threaten the schools. Jupiter ruled things, right? So these are all things that can happen. What, not surprising, there can also be like there can be, I use this word sometimes, like sort of Machiavellian tactics when it comes to truth, justice, order. Like, I'll just do whatever it takes. I'll be ruthless. It's a time where you have to be very careful about people trying to get away with things, especially because of the cloak of mass sort of fear, right? And dealing with this kind of epidemic, that people can also use the moment to try to get away with something that's morally, I guess, nefarious, or like, yeah, just sort of crooked. So like you have to be really careful of that. Then you're thinking about the potential also for there to be like just extreme bravado, right? Just people who think they're right and who want to be strong and who have some, almost like they take to something sectarian in a really, really extreme way. And there could be some heavy bullying of ideas, beliefs, and things like that. So you can watch for that, and watch for that within ourselves right now too. So, I mean, like I said, like I've seen a lot of people really shaming other people for feeling afraid or for, social distancing. Not cool. But at the same time, there's also, again, we have to be careful because fear can easily dominate us right now. So some of that message about don't let fear dominate you is totally legit. Some of it might be used to shame people. The difference in those things right now, we each have to sort of just check in with ourselves about. So anyway, this is the Mars, Jupiter, Pluto combination. When I was figuring out how to talk about this, oftentimes I cast the I Ching. And I cast the I Ching saying, what will the United States government do in this case? Like what is the most likely path moving forward, in terms of just what will happen socially, what kind of policies or response will occur. And I found this really interesting because the I Ching responded with hexagram 1 followed by hexagram 60. I Ching is an ancient Chinese oracle, and it tracks out the different movements and developments of the Tao through the interaction of yin and yang. And each of the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, which you'll pull at random during a reading, will speak to a particular stage of the unfolding of the Tao, and it speaks to what's happening right now within the context of whatever question you ask. So in this case, Terence McKenna. I don't know if you ever followed Terence McKenna, but Terence McKenna loved the I Ching. Lots of really interesting people throughout history. Carl Jung, many others have explored the I Ching, because when studying the I Ching, it's never just a predictive thing that you're doing. You're also studying the archetypes and symbols associated with each of the different, kind of like the different situations that you find yourself in asking a question about. And there's a lot of teachings in them that are rich far beyond just a simple prognostication. But at any rate, in this case, the hexagram 1 is the very first hexagram, which is all yang, and it's typically called creation, or, the active, or something like that. And it really speaks to powerful actions, like a declaration of war, for example, or like the birth of a child, or the birth of a star, like powerful inceptional moments where we're starting something, or there's a feeling of needing to act and take strong action. So all yang lines, right? So I thought, well, that's interesting. So, this means that there's going to be some really strong actions coming up, most likely. And this is, of course, me pondering this while considering this topic that I'm going to talk about today, which is Mars conjoined with Jupiter and Pluto. And the question was specific to the United States, but to be honest, this could apply probably all over the world, because the I Ching, I find oftentimes I'll ask a question and the I Ching will answer more broadly than the question I'm asking. Anyway, the second hexagram, number 60, is called limitations, or restrictions sometimes. And it's a message that this number 60 is about setting boundaries, but being careful to set limits to limits. So there's two different ways we can set limits. For example, let's say that you need to lose a little weight, so you set a limit on your calories. Well, that might be good. But if you start becoming hyper obsessive about the calorie counting, you may need to set a limit to the limit that you've already set. You know what I mean? So the I Ching has this teaching about like limits and limits to limits. Hexagram 1 would mean a really strong action. And hexagram 2, kind of qualifying that, would be about limits or restrictions. So that juxtaposition of hexagrams coming through as I asked the question to understand more about this series of conjunctions and specifically how it relates to the coronavirus and the way that the US government might respond. So my guess would be, and I haven't checked the news today yet on Monday, but my guess would be that more restrictions will be in place, whether it's travel or whether it's bars and restaurants closing down, or I don't know what exactly, but probably more of that kind of stuff coming through as a more widespread plan to mobilize energy, resources, and some kind of response is made. That would be, understandable given the combination of Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto. I would hate to think it would get as serious as like martial law, but I couldn't help but think of the phrase martial law with Mars, the god of war, hitting Jupiter, the god of the law, in Saturn's sign, the sign of restriction. But even if it's not martial law, which might be like really over the top in this case, it could be some kind of government mandates that are very restrictive are coming through as a way of trying to respond positively to a difficult situation. At the same time, different kinds of structures of government, education, anything that represents the larger sense of cosmic, moral, societal unity signified by Jupiter is really being sandwiched right now between Lord of Death and the God of War. And Jupiter is in its fall. So you think that, the markets, like things are really being tested right now by this energy as well. Now, how does all of this apply personally? That's what I want to talk about today, to bring this into the psychological, the spiritual, and the personal. Well, first of all, let's just say that our faith is being tested. Our sense of reality is being tested. Our paradigms are being tested. And if you've ever done something like unplug your cell phone for a week, or go into a technology-free zone on a retreat, or something like that, it's amazing how much we're able to see the dependencies that we have because certain dependencies are taken away temporarily. And we feel cleansed by that. We feel renewed by that. Sometimes we also break down and freak out a little bit because of that. Because there's a certain level of dependency that's not healthy, or even addictive kinds of tendencies. And when paradigms are challenged, on any level, that we typically go through a series of responses. Those responses are the responses, you could say, the transformative, cathartic responses that Pluto ultimately is driving right now as a sort of slow burning dark star engine of this transit. But there's the ability to speculate, or to speculate isn't the right word. There's the ability to reflect and to learn a lot while this is going on, because Jupiter in the midst, even though it's in its fall, is about, is about the learning and growth and even the redeeming of the moral, spiritual, cosmic order. So Jupiter in its fall can be about disappointments, disillusionment, teachers that fail us in some way, or churches, or, governments, or, kind of institutions that are supposed to be beacons of moral clarity and truth sort of falling apart. And we can feel deeply disappointed by that, or deeply disturbed by that when Jupiter is in Capricorn, as I've talked about numerous times in previous videos. Or we can feel that the clarity we're receiving by virtue of something falling apart is really, truly helpful, and perhaps launching us into some kind of renewal. It may take a while. We're in Saturn's sign. We have a ways to go with Jupiter and Capricorn, maybe into 2021 before this kind of energy subsides. Pluto's going to be in cahoots with Jupiter really for the rest of the year. I think it was the 1918 pandemic. Is that when it was? 1918 Spanish flu. That lasted about a year, if I remember correctly. Turn off my phone. It's buzzing. So it's possible that, this lasts a while. but that we're in the grips of a paradigm slowly being deconstructed, and that for many of us, not all of us, I'm not trying to paint some kind of utopian picture here, but for many of us, this is a pivotal moment of redefining and reprioritizing our spiritual moral values. And I think that there's an opportunity there. So we always have to remember the regenerative force behind the catharsis of Pluto, behind the depth and darkness of Hades. The word Hades, of course, means riches. So there are riches here spiritually, but we have to assume the position of the soul in how we're experiencing this. We have to find the action, Mars, that is reflective, that is thoughtful. We have to find the Jupiter that can also see the deeper renewable resource that's within the heart of this experience. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on right now too, that there's personally the potential for us to be reborn into our faith, into a faith that we often, whenever we return to our faith, it's as though we feel like we're coming back to something that we've forgotten. And that, I mean, it just feels so good to come back home in that sense. All right, so now I want to turn our attention to Pan, as promised. Now, there's a book written in 1972 by James Hillman called Pan and the Nightmare. Sorry, you can see it like there. Pan and the Nightmare. This book is written about the god Pan and its relationship to fear, instinct, the life of the soul. It's probably one of my favorite books that Hillman ever wrote. Of course, he was a student of Carl Jung's and a great modern archetypal psychologist. Here's what he says about Pan. He says, above all, we must remember that the Pan experience is beyond the control of the willing subject and his ego psychology. Even when the will is most disciplined and the ego most purposeful, and I'm thinking now of Men in Battle, Pan appears, determining through panic the outcome of the fray. Now, there's a longer passage I'm going to read to you as well, so stick with me because I think it'll be worth it. So first of all, Pan is associated with that. This is why he calls the book Pan and the Nightmare, with that which is instinctual, libidinal, terrifying, thrilling, heart-pounding, but also very instinctual and sort of animalistic. And we don't have a good place for that in our world. Like we see in some ways it's as though we oppose chaos. And for good reason. I'm not suggesting, just let chaos into your house. But chaos exists, right? It's a real part of what we experience in the world. And so having some place for it in the soul, having some understanding of the role that it plays in spiritual life is really important. And that's really I would say, the purpose of this book that Hillman wrote. So here's what he says in a chapter called Imaginal Reality in this book. A little bit longer, so bear with me. To grasp Pan as nature, we must first be grasped by nature, both out there in an empty countryside, which speaks in sounds, not words, and in here, in a startle reaction. Uncanny as the goat's eye, nature comes at us in the instinctual experiences that Pan personifies. But to speak of personification does the god injustice, since it implies that man makes the gods, and that nature is an impersonal abstract field of forces, such as thought conceives it. Whereas the demonic shape of Pan turns the concept of nature into an immediate psychic shock. Western philosophical traditions, from their beginning in the pre-Socratics and the Old Testament, has been prejudiced against images, fantasia, in favor of thought abstractions. In the period since Descartes and the Enlightenment, conceptualizations have held preeminence. The psyche's tendency to personify has been disdainfully put down as anthropomorphism. One of the main arguments against the mythical mode of thinking has been that it works in images, which are subjective, personal, sensuous. This, above all, must be avoided in Western epistemology, and so in descriptions of the forces of nature. To personify has meant to think animistically, primitively, pre-logically. The senses deceive. Images that would relay truth about the world must be purified of their anthropomorphic elements. The only persons in the universe are human persons. Yet, the experience of the gods, of heroes, nymphs, demons, angels, and powers, of sacred animals, places, and things, as persons, indeed precedes the concept of personification. It is not that we personify, but that the epiphanies come as persons. Could we step back from our time, step out of the pretension of the fearing ego who would bring every atom of nature under its control? Then we might realize again that we are not the source of personified gods. We do not make them up any more than we invent the sounds that we hear in the woods, the hoof prints in the sand, the nightmare pressure weighing on our chests. For millennia and most everywhere, it was palpably evident that divine and demonic figures appeared as persons. But the scientific weltanschauung with its cut between observer and observed severed us from that witness, and its testimony became magical thinking, primitive belief, superstition, insanity. Since the imaginal figures still occasionally broke in among the brightest and best educated, as in nightmares, these figures had to be made up by us. They could not be allowed their autonomy, else the scientific universe itself could become a nightmare. Classical scholarship, seduced by the reductive method of science, quickly joined in to explain these apparitions as projections and illusions made up unconsciously by the perceiver. So we find still in Bourgeois' excellent monograph, The Cult of Pan in Ancient Greece, an explanation of Pheidippides' direct encounter with Pan on this messenger's run back to Athens from Marathon, as only a projection of his wish. It is not hard to imagine his tension, depression, and exhaustion by the time when, on his third day of constant running, he encountered the god Pan. So if you don't know this story, Pheidippides is delivering a message back to Athens from Marathon, and on the third day of running straight, he has this encounter with Pan. And what Hillman is saying here is that people will write this off and will say, oh, they're just, telling a story. As the nightmare must derive from indigestion or a too heavy quilt on the body, so Pan must derive from physical dysfunction during Pheidippides' marathon run. Here, scholarship not only fails its subject, it even denies the authority of the text that it is explaining. Herodotus says Pan burst in on Pheidippides, cried out his name while he was running, and gave him a crucial message that saved Athens. The leaders of Athens believed Pheidippides won the battle and set up the cult of Pan in Athens. Were the cunning and intelligent Greeks so deluded? Did all this come about because of the exhausted state of mind of a certain messenger who had a sudden bright idea and conjured up Pan to bless it with authority? In his brilliant, thorough, and devastating critique of reductive falsification of what actually happened, Charles Bohr writes, "This was one of the greatest moments in the history of Western civilization, this apparition of a goat-footed god on the eve of a world-transforming battle, his message of help actually making a momentous difference in the course of events that led to the saving of democracy itself. It is just that no one today, especially professional mythologists, is permitted by the increasing constraints of the subject to take the story seriously anymore. Is the origin of democracy so small a matter, or is something wrong with mythologists? You can take Pan's presence on the eve of Marathon psychologically, many ways. You can take it symbolically. You could even take it historically in a twisted way, in which you can account for the fact of the result, but dismiss the cause as mistaken. But you cannot take it seriously. Something else, if anything at all, must have happened, the scholars say, than what Pheidippides said happened. People on the other side of 5th century Greece were, of course, privileged and privileging to take Pan as the splendid imaginal reality he was. Imaginal figures were visible to them, heard by them, touched by them. They were not, at least in their eyes, making this up." So why did I wanted to read these passages about Pan. First of all, Pan is a god that sometimes appears to us in panic, in pandemonium, in pandemics, in the nightmare. You're walking along the woods, and if you think you see a wolf, you are gripped by the fear that the rabbit knows. And you come into contact with an intelligence that is, yes, different from the required kind of intelligence you need to go to MIT or to develop a vaccine right now for the coronavirus. But that intelligence is nonetheless an intelligence, and it speaks and guides us. And we have a tendency of often privileging things that appear more humane, more rational, and diminishing or degrading that which is more instinctual and quote unquote natural. Sometimes for good reasons. We don't want, for example, to go around dominated by the lower impulses, just carnivorous and chaotic. On the other hand, nature displays a lot of intelligence other than just carnivorous and chaotic. And when we are distancing ourselves too much from nature, there is a strange way in which we start to resemble that which we oppose. So, for example, Pan is a god that will often show up as the almost like the dark face of nature. And it's very tempting to see that dark face of nature, as in right now in the coronavirus, let's say, for example, as a threat that lies outside the city walls. But actually, it lies inside the city walls. And it's a part of our unconscious rejection, distancing, and alienation from nature. This is the interesting role that Pan plays, the goat-footed god, the god related with the sign of Capricorn. So, for example, we think that we're very, very advanced with technology, and in many respects we are. There's many things we can do with technology that animals absolutely cannot do when it comes to, developing, they don't have the internet yet, right? Okay, so +1 humans, or, whatever. But at the same time, what are we using it for? What do we use all of the technology in the world? Let's be real. Let's be a little bit realistic here. We've got a bunch of planets in Capricorn, might as well. A lot of the times we use it for things that are really no better, no more elevated than any animal in nature. We use it to pursue things that we believe will satisfy our senses in the same way that animals may pursue pleasure or food, right? So we pursue maybe our sophistication of how we gratify our senses, or how we feed ourselves, or how we consume is different. Some might even say that it's grossly disproportionate to what animals do. Animals often eat to live. We live to eat, right? So in some ways, what Pan does is through pandemonium, through pandemic, through these transits, is to say, look, you're actually far more of an animalistic creature than you realize. In the way that you reject and alienate yourself from nature is the degree to which you take on and embody the darkest features of nature. And there's a real irony in that. There's a real it's real twisted. So we think we're encased within the city walls and that the dark, unruly, unbridled nature is out there. But oftentimes, because of that rigid, harsh, sort of sectarian division that we have made in order to protect the pursuit of our own interest, our own dominance, all of that kind of stuff, that the dark side of nature is coming out through us. And it's Pan that plays the role of awakening to us to the reality of that side of nature. We will always be in touch with it. You can't wall yourself off from it. You can't set it aside and put it out there, because it's within as well. And it's not about whether or not it exists. It's about how we exist in relationship to it. It's about right relation with the darker, what seem like primitive forces of nature. And that's why Pluto is so important to all of this too. Pluto is really the planetary god that brings out the Pan side of Capricorn, you could say. So this is something that we can think, in other words, right now, of this pandemic literally as bearing a message. We oftentimes say about Pluto that it represents death and rebirth. And we love to get to the rebirth part of this. The paradigms are getting broken down, and this will reboot us and make us even better and bring us into an even more evolved and enlightened future where our technologies will be even better. But in doing that, let's not skip over Pan in our midst. Let's not skip over the goat god that's present in these words we keep saying, pandemic. And what does Pan do? Like a nightmare, Pan grips us and returns us to the animal body so that we can be in touch with the full range of who and what we are, not just the parts we like to isolate and sever off from everything else, which is why, like a homeopathic treatment, when Pan appears in a pandemic, we find ourselves restricted and cut off in order to stop the spread of the virus. So we are forced to take the medicine that we've been taking all along, But now, rather than feeling like medicine, it feels for many of us like poison. We're cut off from the things we love. We're a little bit more restricted in movement. We're more isolated. So yes, and that's a blown up picture of what we have done in relation to nature, of how we exist in relation to nature. And it's Pan that brings that realization. It's Pan that brings the fear that it is an instinctual fear that is actually something that's good to be in right relationship with if we take the time to be connected to the animal level of reality, the animal intelligence of reality, you could say. So, and the other thing is that the soul naturally loves relationship, loves to be in relationship. And when the soul starts getting cut off from certain, kinds of relationships, it's not that the relationships don't continue to exist. It's that they exist through the lens of the severe alienation or cut or separation that we've made. Have you ever tried ignoring someone? Like maybe remember back into like 4th grade when you're like, I'm going to ignore you. I'm going to give you the silent treatment. Well, if you do that, like I remember I had a friend who gave me the silent treatment for like a week in school. And it was like our relationship existed. It just existed through the lens of silence. It wasn't like the relationship went away. So similarly, we as spirit souls, the thing that nourishes the soul is to recognize that the soul is in relationship with all of reality. Because this, at the center of every sentient being is God, is divinity. If divinity is at the center of everything, then divinity is also the means by which all nodes in the matrix relate to one another. Relational reality is what we're living in. And so in some ways, the symbolism, the really important reason to kind of dig into that word Pan also related to the word, similar root words as pastoral, pastor. And of course, Pan is a pastoral and sort of a god associated with herdsmen. We're talking about the herd right now, right? The herd, protect the herd, right? That's what people are saying. Pan is a god, a pastoral god, a god of herdsmen. It's interesting that one of the things that we can learn about this is that there's this way when you get in a herd that you have of thinking of everything that's inside the herd versus everything that's outside of the herd. And this is a role also closely, this is a symbolic duty that Saturn also carries as the dimmest, most distant planet that sits on the gateway between the visible and the invisible, the keeper of boundaries. Well, one of the great sicknesses of our age is that we have made nature into something impersonal, a matter of chemicals and impersonal forces and laws to be basically raped with the rational mind. And when we do that, there will come a point in time, because nature is fundamentally stronger than us. In other words, there are forces and other beings in nature that are stronger than us, that we will be put into a situation like we are right now. It happens. Stars die, solar systems die. There's no one sits at the top of the food chain in a universe that's always recycling forever. It always has been and it always will be. So it's very important when you think of the role that Pan plays, right, and especially just right now, that Pan is helping us to stay awake to our place in the greater order of things. And it's not an impersonal order. It's not, these aren't just, so it's like right now, one of the things that people are doing in the news that I'm personally trying to stay away from doing is being like, give me the numbers, give me the facts, give me the rates of mortality, give me the chances, give me the odds, right? Notice that as we're so obsessed with numbers, number crunching, odds making, dealing in life and death, which population is going to die, which isn't, how does it affect me? Am I at risk? Am I not? Oh, it's just the old people, all this kind of thing. Wall Street is, collapsing. The great institution of consumptive digital, marketing and numbers and greed and self-interest is collapsing, right? So of course, these things take turns. They'll probably bounce back, or it'll come. Who knows what the future holds? But I'm just saying, in this moment, it's specifically tempting when Pan comes around to try to, isolate, restrict back, and keep out the actual personhood of nature. To say, oh, it's, just numbers and forces and methods and procedures and rules and laws and restrictions and like that. We miss an opportunity, even if it's just personally while we're social distancing from home, to sit down and say, what is Pan saying? What is this? How does this virus appear as a person, as a voice in my dreams? What does it say? What does it speak? What does it need? What does it want? Things can exist on multiple levels simultaneously. The reality is multivalent, multidimensional, archetypal. So a virus can speak to us on many levels if we're listening. We can't listen if we try to set up a wall from the actual experience of what's happening. That's specifically what Saturn and Pluto conjunction is also about. Is about the detonation of the borders and walls that we try to set up between ourselves and the instinctual forces of reality that are always embodied living entities that we are in relationship with. Trees, rocks, stars, people, birds, plants, viruses. This is a relational reality that we live in. And Pan is a god that can bring us back there through panic, through pandemonium, through nightmare, etc. Because unfortunately, we become so dissociated in our sense of how important and special and apart we are from everything, right? That we forget. And so sometimes it takes the seizure of instinctual fear to bring us back. That is precisely what Hillman's book, Pan and the Nightmare, is about. I recommend you read it because I can't represent it nearly as well as a Pulitzer Prize nominated author can. But his book is fantastic. And I wanted to just give a little pep talk for Pan in our midst. Try to remind us, because I need the reminder, not because I'm sitting on some high horse. I need the reminder not to just look at my phone and be like, what are the numbers today? But to spend some time realizing that this is a voice that's speaking to us. Nature speaks. As astrologers, we should be interested in the fact that the word Pan is being repeated day in and day out, that the goat-horned god is being recited by the lips of millions of people right now, right? As these planetary configurations come together in the sign of the goat, the sea god, the sea goat, the god of Capricorn. This is one of the gods of Capricorn. It's so tempting to just say, oh, it's the devil. And we don't like the devil. We think the devil is bad. And so we hold the devil at bay with number crunching, But the angel of death is still an angel. The messenger, Pan, the terrifying, goat-horned, scary god, it's a terrifying messenger. And so it's okay to be afraid, but think of the presence of Pan in that story that we told about the battle, the runner, the Pheidippides and the run from Marathon to Athens. It's the goat god in the fear and the panic that delivers the message that brings about a great victory and preserves democracy, preserves the social order, doesn't let things go into pandemonium. But they weren't saying, oh, that was just we were just personifying Pan, and it was really just a really great intellectual idea that he came up with. Unless we receive nature, unless we receive this virus as a messenger, as an omen, as a sign of something more than just what will happen when Mars conjoins Jupiter, Jupiter conjoins Pluto, what will happen. It's also, what is it saying? What is the message? And it's not just one message. Each of us can experience that we be in reception with the signs and symbols of the times. So I'm certainly not capable of saying exhaustively what Pan is saying right now, but I think it's important to hey, Pan, wow, this is, we're living in a moment where if you've ever had any doubts about the reality of archetypal psychology, the reality of the gods, living beings, and so many of them. Now is a great time, if you're into astrology, like you're reaping the benefits of your studies, And that's one really amazing side to this. I'll say one last thing to close, which is just that because the soul is a relational being, by nature, the soul is offended when things are objectified. When the virus is spoken of only in numbers, something in our soul shuts off. And when we're spoken about that way too, when you're only thought of as your accomplishments or your mistakes, when you or me, are only thought of as our possibilities, potentials, and outcomes, isn't there something so fundamentally offensive about that? Because don't we all crave intimacy where the way in which we know is not finally quantifiable but felt? Isn't that what it means to be alive? And so similarly, as an astrologer, I have to say that I think salvation comes through relationships. Not, and when I mean relationships, of course, I mean love is the driving force of all relationships, but love is not some puritanical thing that pushes out the difficult things, that gives silent treatment to the difficult things. Love is something that engages with everything, fully confident that we're all eternal. And so the relationship becomes the bearer of our salvation if we trust that God is at the center of it, that divinity is at the center of it, that eternity, truth is at the center of it, that beauty is at the center of it. And I don't just mean some kind of, like, I don't know what, a Martha Stewart catalog type of beauty. Sometimes the love and beauty we're talking about is tremendously terrifying at times. But would we want anything less than a real love? I think that's what it is. I think that's what love is. I think it's real. I think higher love says yes to everything. And although Pan is one of the most difficult messengers of love, if we make Pan into the devil, if we make the goat god into the devil, if we demonize Capricorn and just associate it with the patriarchy or something like that, we miss the entirely complex and really kind of, beautiful but heavy or dark side of the messenger of Pan. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. And I hope that this has been interesting to you. I hope that you've found some meaning in this. I'd love to hear your comments in the comments section below. Tell me how things are going for you right now. Tell me what kind of messages, signs, symbols, or meaning you've been deriving from watching some of this unfold. If you're not dialed into all of this right now, how else do you see these Capricornian planets playing out in your life? I'd love to hear from you guys. So we'll be back again soon. Lots more transits to take a look at. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.